Hello, you're listening to the latest season of the COVID Inquiry podcast. This week, Nicola is joined by Lorelei King, actor, screenwriter, narrator, and most pertinently, a member of the COVID-19 Bereaved Families for Justice group. Together, they're going to reflect on how the recent hearings went and look forward to the next few days of evidence. Please note, some listeners may find the contents of this podcast distressing.
Hello everyone, I am Nicola Brook and I'm the solicitor at BJC with day-to-day responsibility for managing our work on the COVID inquiry on behalf of COVID Bereaved Families for Justice UK. I'm joined here with my co-host Lorelei King, who is a member of the group, having very sadly lost her husband to COVID. Joining us today to discuss the evidence heard in week 2 is Reverend Charlotte Hudd. You may recall she gave evidence in week 1 on behalf of the Royal College of Nursing. So thank you very much for joining us today, Charlotte.
You're welcome. Thank you for inviting me.
We're so pleased to see you. Your testimony in week 1 had a huge impact. A lot of people in our group, in the bereaved group, are still talking about it. It was incredibly powerful. And in our week 1 podcast, it was we usually do our standout moment, and in your testimony was my standout moment, which was when you were talking about the death rattle.
Oh, yes.
And you were cut off.
Yeah.
And as I said at the time, for me, I just think this is, for me, what this inquiry does is it just sanitizes things. And I think we need to hear those powerful and raw things. That's my opinion. But for me, that was my standout moment of week 1. I wonder if you could tell us a little bit, or remind us a little bit about your testimony that week. What you thought were the most important things that you brought forward.
I think the most important things that were really being asked was validation for things like the impact on where nursing homes and care homes were in the bigger picture, especially for resources. Certainly my end of things like masks, getting enough equipment in a timely way. Also, I think, and others would agree, that as announcements were being made publicly, sometimes public announcements would be made ahead of the social care service being informed. So, on the one hand, great communication's great in that it's out there. But then the fallback is when a minister says, "Oh, and now you can enter nursing homes with this, and this, with these measures in place," and then we hear about it and think, "Well, we're going to need a week or two to put those measures in place, and it could even be building something." So it was good to be able to say that out loud, because the public addresses were what they were. Everyone watched and listened, but in the scenes at the care home, it could be, naturally people phone, "Oh, when can we come in and see my loved one?" Not yet, and having to settle people down, but having good relationships throughout. I think that's the key thing. That's probably the main thing that stood out, was the investment in relationships with staff, with relatives, outside agencies, to the home. Relationship is everything. Communication is everything.
I agree with you. My husband died in care, and so this module is especially close to my heart. And that, in your testimony, had an impact on me when you said the guidance would sort of airily be given out on whenever it was, a Friday or whatever, saying, for example, visits could be allowed with mitigations, with giving you no time to prepare, and even assuming that many care homes had the facility. Not all could have whatever they needed, PPE, a special airlock room, whatever. It was just so unfair.
Yeah, it was certainly a challenge, but people's creative sides, who you didn't know existed, sort of came out, and I think being in a small environment like a nursing home, where that sudden intensity of moments being with people so close up. And then suddenly we get to realize there's all these skills and resources and awesome human stuff that suddenly starts to spill out. And then that's awesome. I find it really incredible how people in adversity suddenly really put out for each other. And yeah, that's awesome.
That was like a really warm and powerful moments in your testimony when you talked about that. And what occurs to me is, you're right, of course, people were amazing. I thought people accomplished amazing things. The bit that annoys me is that I don't feel it was met by the
Yeah,
government, who should have been offering support. We had to rely on ourselves, on the goodwill of everyone. And of course, people are decent,
yeah,
and they do come forward. Nicola, can I bring you in on this?
Yeah, I totally agree that the government in power at the time totally took advantage of the goodwill of people to step up when they were stepping back and leaving us to it. And you can't take advantage of a sector like the care sector and then expect it to step up again next time. And the one thing that has come out in both week 1 and 2, time and time again, is how this is a sector that is undervalued, underappreciated, low paid, low job security. And yet we're still going to expect them to step up when the next pandemic happens. And we all know it is a when, not an if.
Yeah, 100%. I just would like to say to Reverend Charlotte, I consider myself oddly lucky that my husband died at the beginning of the pandemic. So I didn't have to suffer and struggle the way the families must have in the care home that you worked at. And I just also have to say that, given the choice, I wish there were dozens of you in every care home, because I'm getting emotional, but your
mm,
care really came through.
I
That's
second that. Your care for the people you were looking after was so palpable. And I do not know how you made it through those 10 days when you were the only nurse there looking after all 20 residents, one of whom required really intense care. I just don't know how you did it. And I'm sure the families of the residents you were looking after were grateful and expressed their thanks to you at the time. But wow, what a remarkable person to have made it through. And I have no doubt you didn't come through that unscathed. But it really was fantastic of you to step up in that way. And I hope you do feel appreciated.
yeah, absolutely. On the build up to realizing that I'm not going home. I don't know if you remember the testimony. There was a sense of panic beginning to build in me on the days preceding the not going home day, because I was just watching, every time I reassembled the rotor, it would just disappear because another person was positive, or they called in ill, or something happened, and then I just watched it sort of go down. But oddly, when I'd said goodbye to that last nurse, then in a way it was a strange thing. On the one hand, I suddenly felt imprisoned by, I have no choice. I have this code of conduct which talks about safety, 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 and these are all the things, and I feel like, and I felt really sort of trapped by that. But then after sort of settling a bit, I realized, well, actually that decision has been made for me now, so I don't have to make that decision because it's been made for me. So that was almost like a backhanded relief. I don't even know if that even makes sense. And then once that was like, okay, this is really happening, what I had feared might, then did. So right, it has. And then phone calls to husband, family, to my RCN rep, to my colleagues from the Queen's Nursing, I just threw out all my safety nets. I thought, I can't do this on my own. My local minister was great. And I had that profound moment in the cupboard. The drug cupboard was a really good place. It was my safety place. I could hide and cry and do whatever I needed to do in there, fall apart, come back together and go out, you know. But
I
yeah,
was going to say you might need to give that some context, otherwise the drug cupboard being a fantastic place.
Oh,
People might get the wrong idea.
Okay, so most nursing homes have a drugs room. Some smaller places, it's basically a glorified cupboard. It's like a big cupboard, and that's where we keep the medicines and the sink and the trolley and all the stuff. So yeah, I wasn't doing a Harry Potter under the stairs or anything. So this was the drug cupboard, which is the only place that had a lock apart from the loo that I could go into. And being the only registered nurse, only I was permitted the keys and things. So it was a little sanctuary. But it was also a profound moment in my faith that, you know, you can do this. This can happen, and I'm with you. You know, the Father is with me. So, and then things just sort of went on, and again with those you know, those seeing everybody else put out, like, you know, they had children, some of them, or older parents. All these caregivers, these awesome caregiving people who are on a minimum wage and really naff hours, they do it because they are so loving, because they often have a role at home, a loving, caring, supporting role. They come here and do this thing, and they have each other, and just seeing some of these guys bloom and really getting to know them, you know, there are gems out there, some real gem people, and I really saw I saw the best of the best. I also saw the worst of the worst, because you know how people can be, but you know, the bit I have to remember, and I think you're saying, Lorelei, you know, you sort of have to, you can get drowned out by politics sometimes, and absolutely it's there for purpose, and I've been, you know, quite cynical on various things, but it's that human, right, you know, in it together. And when it comes to that, I think some of the government policy, which, you know, these recommendations or law, or, you know, the overnight law of lockdown and various other things, people have a way of making their own policy. So I would say, so when it came to a time of when visits were allowed, you know, more frequently, it got to a stage where there was so less amount of staff left. I was speaking to my manager and I said, look, when can I let the family come in? And he eventually, like, okay, because, you know, it's getting quite serious. We did have a couple of family. One pretty much lived in, and she did pretty much the same protocol that I did, living in there. You know, she wore a mask, blah blah blah, about the home, just as a staff member would. So we did have a family member living with us for a bit. I did a risk assessment on that, and I was so relieved that her loved one had someone there when we couldn't, you know, because that was one of our real angsts, was abuse by omission because there aren't enough of us. That was really, really tough. And just having to do the hierarchy of human need, that was really, really difficult. So when this one particular relative came in, one night I remember seeing her on the top floor. We had our masks and everything on, and our nighties, and that was quite a moment. And then we had another lady come in. It's always the women, isn't it? You know, we do the thing. was in almost every day. Again, the same protocol of testing and everything else to come in, but again, it was someone else with that person, and it was, yeah, it was really quite something. Who knew? Who would ever have thought? You know, and
Who would have thought?
yeah, yeah. I mean, in amongst all that, and it was like every time something for me started to go, I started to feel like a spiral. Like, oh no, I've got to do this really big clinical thing that's going to take a really long time with my complex person, and I haven't got another pair of hands. And if I did get them, it would take them off the floor, and I'd be going in my head. Then suddenly there'd literally be a knock at the door, and this person from the hospice turned up, and she said, I was literally passing. And I remember grabbing her by the scruff and going, right, I need you here. And things like that happened. Now, if you've seen Slumdog Millionaire, have you seen that when he no? Okay, so Slumdog Millionaire is an awesome film. And at the very end of it, he has to answer these really difficult questions. The only way he answers these very difficult questions, because he wants to save the love of his life, is that he pulls all the memories from way back, incidents in his life that has built up to help him come up with these answers at the end of the film. So it was a bit like that for me. So as I started to think, how am I going to sleep? I'm never going to sleep. I can't be awake 24 hours a day. And then that film, it took me back to, hold on a minute, I've been a parent of tiny babies who never sleep. And when you're sore and everything else, I could do this. And that was just like something always seemed to come out. You know, there'd be times when I would like silently scream, and I'd feel the ground pulling me in, but then something would come up, either from my past or literally someone at the door, and it's like, hallelujah.
I think this is just something extraordinary in your nature and your resilience. I could tell watching your testimony though, because I, like many of the bereaved, I could tell when there was a movie in your head. I could tell when you were reliving, because we all have that experience too. But it was some of the most powerful testimony I've seen. And I feel a bit strange moving on from that to week 2 testimony, which powerful in a different way, shall we say. There were a lot of interesting points this week. For me, I thought the CQC talking about their behavior during the pandemic, and then of course the witnesses from UXA and Jenny Harries. So, Nicola, could I bring you on? We had Mary Cridge, who was testifying on behalf of the Care Quality Commission, and she said some pretty extraordinary things. But I'm going to come to you first and see what you think.
Yeah, so week 2, we heard from a number of witnesses from the regulators in each of the UK nations. So Mary Cridge was from the Care Quality Commission, which operates in England. So she reminded us all that 16th of March 2020, that was the date that they decided to cease routine inspections. Rather refreshing, actually. She owned that and said this was the CQC's decision to do this. She was at pains to say that it was routine inspections that they were stopping, not all inspections. And the idea behind it was to allow providers to just get on with their work without them adding another layer to their work, but also to ensure that their inspectors weren't unwittingly spreading COVID, and also to stop their own staff being placed at risk. She wanted to make the point that inspections aren't the only way that they gather intelligence, that they are constantly receiving intelligence either from relatives or from staff. The real problem here is that they were no longer going to receive that intelligence from relatives because they were no longer able to go in. So if there were concerns that you might notice on a visit, that wasn't going to happen anymore. And one thing she did say that confused me, she said that sort of intelligence informed where we went when we got back out in May. So hang on a minute. You said that you're only stopping routine inspections, but then why was it only in May that you're then acting on any of the intelligence? So on the one hand, she's trying to give reassurance, saying that, you know, we would go out if there was a concern, but then she's kind of saying that that only started from May. So if someone's flagging a concern in March and you're not going out until May, that's a terribly long time for people to be left in what might be a risky situation, and for their loved one to not have that concern addressed. And it may be that I've misunderstood her evidence, but it was never clarified with the witness. And as you know, we can't just ask a question and ask that that be clarified. But I thought that was quite an important issue. And then it was put to her the views of John's campaign, which said that the people that they supported felt that CQC had abdicated responsibility, oversight and regulation was lacking, and that people had been abandoned in the name of infection control. And then Professor Vic Rayner, who joined us on the podcast last week and who also gave evidence in week one, her quote, "The decisions made by the CQC in March effectively resulted in the withdrawal of CQC oversight from adult social care services for the duration of the pandemic." And Mary Cridge responded to those, saying she doesn't agree there was an abdication of responsibility. She again made the point that it was only routine inspections that were paused. But she says, "I absolutely accept that would have felt very different for providers and for families, but inspections did resume once we had PPE." So again, this comes back to, it was only once they were able to go out, rather than something might be happening, we need to get in there regardless of PPE.
Can I ask you a question about regarding this? It was Kevin Mitchell on the Tuesday, I think, who on behalf of the care inspector at Scotland gave this testimony about how there was, I gather, a home in some terrible state that he really needed an inspection. I guess I get confused because of the devolved nations. I don't know if that would have fallen under the CQC, or was it, my impression was that it had been somehow stopped. Would have been stopped by the CQC?
So he was saying that it was Public Health Scotland who would have to give them the permission to go into to inspect. So he said the decision to stop inspections was primarily on the advice of Public Health Scotland, who were concerned about the risk inspectors would pose in terms of transmitting the virus. But he said we needed to reserve the right to go out and inspect when it was absolutely necessary to do so. Public health advice made that very difficult, in fact, to do without the agreement of Public Health Scotland. And he continued saying that there were repeated representations made to the directors of public health that we would need to inspect in certain circumstances, but it was quite clear that there was a degree of nervousness about us going on site. It was made very clear that no visit could take place unless under the clinical direction of the directors of public health. We were keen to leave an option open for us to go against public health. We wanted to have that option if necessary, but to be honest, it would have been very difficult. We didn't, in fact, go against public health advice. If we did, that would have been quite a serious situation, potentially in terms of liability and responsibility for us, but it was one that we wanted to be left open, but we never used it. And I find that really quite disturbing, that they as a regulator have a concern, want to go on site to inspect in person, but that there are people above them saying you can't do that. I find that quite concerning, and I can only imagine that people with loved ones in homes in Scotland where if they had those concerns, that would have offered them no comfort at all.
And Charlotte, what was your experience of the CQC during the pandemic?
So it was I'm just trying to think when we had. Do you know what? I think we'd had an inspection just before the lockdown in my first home. So there weren't any visits during the time that I was during the hot time of COVID. But I can imagine if there had been any, it would have added enormous extra anxiety onto the workforce, and onto the workforce ability to look after the residents, knowing that they were the workforce, especially in the early days, everyone was afraid of everything and didn't quite understand everything. I think something like an inspection during that time would have felt, it may well have felt like a beating stick. Whether it's meant that way or not, I don't think so. But how you feel when you're already quite vulnerable and under pressure, it could feel like someone with a beating stick coming along. However, CQC tend to come regulate it when there's a response to something. It's when it smells systemic. If there's a whiff that something systemic's going on and being perpetuated, then yes, things will come forward quite quickly. When it comes to perhaps someone making an alert about a particular safety aspect or a safeguarding risk, they are your first port of call. So when it comes to and we've always been very open that if you've got an issue, like when people have come to me, this is how it's being resolved. However, if you wish to this and this, but if there's a safeguarding matter, they are the ones, because they are local and they are experts in that. CQC is probably more of the the systemic running of things. So I don't know if that's of any comfort at all to any feeling like, oh gosh, CQC disappeared into the background. The safeguarding and the immediate services of adult social care are really sharp and quick and supportive with, and something that would have been going on, and they certainly were for me when I called them, because it was going on.
I think that will be reassuring to some. There was one thing before we leave this topic that actually I'll ask Nicola for clarification. Apparently at 2023, the number of inspections was still incredibly low. And she said it was due to a change to IT and structure and operating and model and procedure. And she said she considered it a failed transformation. And what is that?
Yeah, she said that essentially they'd had this transformation to the service. It came across as though during the pandemic they'd realized there were all these different ways of doing things, like Zoom and whatnot, and that they tried to maybe streamline the service, but that essentially, as you say, it was a failed transformation. Again, it wasn't very clear what she was referring to, but again, quite refreshingly honest in that she was able to admit failures, which we don't see very often from the witnesses that are called in the inquiry. But hopefully we'll start to see those inspections go back up to where they need to be.
There was one thing that our lawyer, Anna Morris, who was on behalf of our group, brought up about whether the CQC was endorsing the policy of discharging patients into care homes. And there was some extraordinary exchange about their logo being on the brochure or whatever it is. And where she said, oh, no, it wasn't on the front, which I thought was a ridiculous response to the question.
Yeah, so she said that the CQC was asked by the Department of Health and Social Care by email for a statement indicating complete support for the hospital discharge policy. And the CQC said that they weren't involved in the development of the guidance, so they didn't issue the statement in the way that it was requested. And what Anna put to her was that the CQC's logo appeared on the guidance, and that might have given the impression that the CQC therefore endorsed the guidance, and therefore that might have been felt by providers as pressure to take in people who had been discharged from hospital where they didn't have a negative test. And Mary Cridge said, "This may sound like dancing on the head of a pin, but our logo was not on the front of that guidance. We were just on an item in Annex C." It's just okay, but your logo still appeared on an annex that was part of that guidance. And she did accept that providers were under extreme pressure, and it was something that was discussed amongst the CQC. But she was at pains to say that their logo wasn't on the front page alongside NHS and DHSC. It was only on the annex.
Yeah, that was a moment. On the Tuesday, we had a couple of really interesting witnesses. I thought Christina McNee on behalf of the trade union Congress was very strong, but I think, Nicola, you wanted to talk about Julie Parkinson. I wasn't able to hear her testimony. She testified on behalf of the National Association of Care and Support Workers.
Yeah, she was really interesting. So she had set up her own domiciliary care agency, and this is an area that we haven't heard much about. And was, if care homes were overlooked, then domiciliary care was really overlooked. So she said that they had her agency had 15 employees and 23 clients. So because of a lack of availability of nurses and things going into people's homes, a lot of her care workers were having to carry out healthcare tasks that they weren't used to doing, things like wound care. So they were having to get basic training on how to do that. She also explained how she had real problems getting appointments for doctors to come out and visit people who were bedbound. So clearly they weren't able to go there. And she said there were times that her workers were on hold for 45 minutes just trying to get through to the surgery. And then they were having to have, she said, very robust conversations with receptionists to try to get care. And she said, we always achieved our aims. We always got the care. It was just an extra burden having to fight for that. And then she talked about the guidance that they received. There were things like videos and posters on how to don and doff the PPE. But on the videos, it was showing someone in a clinical environment with a special room that was where they would don and doff. And you've got a clinical waste bin right next to you that's foot operated, so you're not touching anything, so you can dispose of it safely. Whereas people in domiciliary care, they're having to do that on the doorstep of the person they're going into. They don't have a waste disposal, so they're having to carry that clinical waste around with them. And so there was just no acknowledgement that domiciliary care was different and needed different guidance. And she said that as a manager, she felt completely isolated. She didn't have a team of admin staff. So it was just her receiving all these different bits of guidance and guidelines, and she was having to pick her way through it, interpret it herself, and then also try to figure out what the difference was from the previous iteration. And that she said she would ring up the helpline trying to find out, trying to get help. And then she would just be told, oh, well, we've sent you all the guidance that there is. She's like, yes, I know I've got it, but I want to know what's different, what's changed. It just really, really basic things like, I don't know, maybe showing a tracked changes version so you can see what's been removed or what's added. Yeah, she said that the information for us was either tacked on at the end or there was nothing. And just really, really felt like, if at best an afterthought, at worst not a thought at all. And I thought it was really important that we heard her evidence. And interestingly, amongst her staff and her patients, they didn't have any transmission. The only people that they were supporting who caught COVID caught it when they'd gone into hospital for an X-ray or an appointment and brought it back. So there was no transmission within her service at all, which I thought was, given the difficulties they had, I thought that was remarkable.
I found the TUC witness incredibly strong, and I wanted to talk to Charlotte about this because she talked about many things. One, she had a real go at the CQC going in to do inspections and got cut off. But Anna Morris, our lawyer, let her get it out. I'll come to you in a minute for that, Nicola. But she also talked about the sick pay money and how the way that it was used was not monitored in any way. And you had some experience with the sick pay money as well. I remember from your testimony, Charlotte.
Yes. So when I came out, so after the acute bit of the illness, I really started to think about this. And staff were coming back to work way too soon. And I know the catch-22 thing is you don't want to leave your colleagues in the lurch. And then there was the golden 10 days that's burned in everyone's brain. You need to be, isolated for at least 10 days from, contracting, la, la, la. So then what happened is after 10 days, regardless if you were well or not, there was the expectation, which we put on ourselves as well as inadvertently on each other, to come back to work, to be with each other and to support each other. Part of the reason for coming back early was it was statutory sick pay, which, yes, fortunately Boris announced earlier on that you won't have to wait till day 4 or 5 to get anything. You'll have it from day 1. So, okay, that was good. But that was all there was. And in peacetime, that's a thing. But what really got to me is that a lot of these guys, they were very ill. And when I found out about the ring-fenced infection control money, which had been allocated by Central in two waves, and we're looking at millions being allocated to the social care sector. And one of the top things now, of course, it doesn't say, it's not in statute. It's a strong recommendation, but the point is, it was on the top line to this money is being allocated to these services paid by the taxpayer from Central to support infection control measures in the care home, including top line staff, paying your staff a wage, not indefinite a wage, their normal wage, but at least for that acute time of being ill. And then, of course, this didn't happen. So I started to do my homework. I looked on the sites where freedom of public information and things like that. I went to local authority, spoke to my employer, and I went to our MP as well. I managed to get a voice conference with him and his PA, because I felt he needed to know what was happening in his constituency. And the thing was, it wasn't a case of where can I blame anything. The frustrating thing is these people are going without. These people really deserve it. And yes, staff were saying to me, Charlotte, I'm not being ungrateful or anything, but people get furlough, and I'm really glad to have a job, but how is it that so much percent is happening there and we get nothing? How do I answer that? I know you shouldn't compare furlough with that, but actually your health and social care workforce were pretty important at that time, and especially when money had been ring-fenced. So I didn't have anything really conclusive. So going to LA didn't really go anywhere. Didn't really go anywhere with my employer, and my MP, I don't think he even knew what to do, and he probably had 100 million other things going on as well. But I thought either way, he needs to know, and it needs to be minuted, because one day this is going to come back. And thank goodness it has, because here we are. And too right, we should be talking about this. So I still don't know what happened to that, and I'm still really cross for those people that were minimum wage already with others to look after, who didn't get at least 10 days worth of full pay for their service. Of course, money can't replace what happened, but it just felt like a poke in the eye. So yeah, I was on the union warpath for quite a while with that, and quite rightly so. And I felt so cross about it that I raised some money for the Cavell Nurses Trust for other nurses and carers who'd been like really disadvantaged and not helped by the system. I was so cross. Still am.
Rage is the engine, I tell you. But you kind of answered it, because I was going to ask you if you had any, if things had developed at all, if you'd heard any more about it. It sounds like not.
No, and again, yeah, but because it wasn't actually a stipulated have to. It was like highly top recommended guidance, and that's the loophole.
Yes, and this has to be absolutely, I think, dealt with in the recommendations that come out of this inquiry. Nicola, can we go back to the thing where this witness had a real go at the CQC and about not going in to do inspections, and counsel for the inquiry kind of cut her off until our lawyer kind of let her vent? What was going on there?
Yeah, so before we got to our feet, she had said it seemed strange to me, and it still does, that the CQC stopped going out to do inspections at a time of a pandemic. Now, it may be that counsel to the inquiry didn't take that any further because she knew that we had permission to ask questions about it, possibly. But under Anna's questioning, she said that the regulatory framework was very poor. The fact that they did stop the inspections was astonishing. You would think at a time of a pandemic that the regulators would have stepped up rather than stepped away. We were astonished by this decision. It would have, I think, caused harm to the sector, both to the staff and to the patients. And that's the real issue. She said the fact that the CQC weren't going in to check meant that things like high infection rates in a particular care home weren't being properly picked up on and addressed. The fact that there was nobody going in to inspect and check whether there was adequate PPE was provided, or that staff had been trained on how to use it, meant that there was probably more likely to be cross-infection. Now, bearing in mind, we've got the likes of Matt Hancock and Susan Hopkins defending the hospital discharge decision by saying that wasn't the main route of ingress of the disease, that it was more likely from staff. Doesn't that tell you that making sure that the staff had the right PPE and were properly trained in how to use it, doesn't that reinforce the need of the CQC to just check, hey guys, just want to know, do these instruction videos work? Do you understand it? Have you got what you need? And that's the importance of the inspection. I can understand that that would have been another cause for anxiety amongst staff about having to cope with an inspection. But I think the CQC could have alleviated that anxiety by communicating that we are coming in just to check these things, because we know that everyone's doing their best in very difficult times. And I think that could have been managed better, rather than we're just not going to do it anymore.
You mentioned Susan Hopkins. Shall we move on to Wednesday's witnesses? Susan Hopkins, on behalf of UXA, the UK Health Security Agency, and Dame Jenny Harries, who was a former Deputy Chief Medical Officer for England. I don't even know where to begin. So I'm going to let someone else go.
Both of these women give me the absolute rage. Susan Hopkins in module 3 was still trying to justify the IPC guidance that pretty much said we have no evidence that COVID is airborne. She still struggles to accept that COVID is airborne. And that is just crazy to me. Now, at the very start of her evidence, she said that her organisation, which was Public Health England at the time, it's now UK Health Security Agency, she says, we maintain and are the primary source of infectious disease surveillance data for the country. Now, that's really important. So keep that in mind, because later on in her evidence, she turns to something. And this was a SAGE paper, which was talking about whether there was sustained transmission. And she said it was a SPIMO statement on the 2nd of March saying it is highly likely that there is sustained transmission of COVID in the UK at present. But they do nothing. It takes another 11 days for Public Health England to update guidance. And what she says about this is the SPIMO paper wasn't publicly released. So I don't think those papers were publicly read for a long time. I definitely didn't recollect seeing it as the incident director for Public Health England at the time, though clearly we'd had our first community case on the 28th of Feb. So she's saying that this SPIMO paper didn't come to her attention. The SPIMO paper saying we have sustained transmission in the UK, and she's saying that because she didn't read their paper, she didn't know about it. But as we've just said, her organisation is responsible for surveillance. So where would SPIMO have got the information about community transmission? It's her organisation that's responsible for surveillance of transmission of COVID, but she doesn't know that we have community transmission. That to me is one of the most concerning bits of evidence I've heard. How can she not know?
Well, this, unless I'm mistaken, this is a woman, I believe, who at one point anyway admitted that the virus was airborne, and also at the same time said, or was aerosol, and at the same time said that masks didn't work. So she, Lady Hallett, interesting, and I want to ask Charlotte about this in a second. Lady Hallett pressed her on the guidance from February 2020, some particular language that was used where she, it actually said, you know, it's unlikely that anyone in care homes will be infected by the virus. And she sort of pressed her on that, and she sort of fudges and said it was awkward language. She did finally admit in hindsight that it was regrettable. But I wondered, Charlotte, because you were working in care at that time, around February 2020, I don't know if you remember what your feeling was about care homes and possible infection.
It was a strange time, I guess. See, care homes, we've always been at risk of infections and of passing them around, which has also made us quite diligent in early intervention. So, you know, not a winter goes by without an outbreak of norovirus, or more, and or even C. diff, or influenza. So care homes are pretty good at responding to, oh, there's one, there's two, okay, then we follow public health guidance on that. So it being said that it's unlikely to affect care homes, I think that's just wishful thinking, really, because care homes have always been a vulnerable area because of the high traffic of people coming and going, staff and visitors, and the nature of the residents being vulnerable and having multiple comorbidities and reduced immunity and things. So I think without it being said, we knew we weren't immune. But I think, see, this is where there's such a huge diversity of care home sector. So you've got your registered nursing homes where you've got people like me who can be really stubborn, and we can just say no, and then we can bash people with the code of conduct and anything else, and we're trained to be quite belligerent as well. So when it came to, so when you're talking about discharges from hospital to care homes, unfortunately, my then manager in my first home was also a registered nurse, and of the the hard sort of stoic stuff, where infection control. I mean, Nightingale wrote a book on it a couple of 100 years ago. The fundamentals don't change, and we said no. It was horrible to say that, but we say no because I know it was, and it's one of those horrible things. We know the hospitals are up against it and they're bursting, but no, because then that bursting will come here. So I do remember feeling really quite proud that our nurse manager was, she said no, and then she would make that call. Have there been so many, then tests that are clear, blah, blah, blah. And yes, we did all the usual precautions when they arrived anyway. But I think that's where perhaps it's been a lot harder for other care homes that haven't had a registered, stubborn clinician. I mean, some of them are stubborn managers without being a clinician, go them. But I think when you're sort of comparing, I think we have that, nurses have the edge of that knowledge intensive, safety critical way of thinking about things and just being stubborn what's-its.
I think from what you've just said, it just kind of reinforces even in February. And I know in my husband's care home, the staff were worried a lot more than the government were long before the government. And just anecdotally, I was like, really? They were very worried about what was coming.
And yeah, there was a lot of I mean, yes, there was a lot of fear, and I remember people. And I was sort of just on the edge of ministerial training then. I was still going through a process, and all the existential questions start coming out. Oh, Charlotte, and that there would be quite big conversations, and then lots of worries and panic. But again, the angle for them, because I was feeling it as well, and I was doing quite a big, hefty commute at the time, so I had to be really super mindful that, how I was getting to and from work. But again, just that thing of, infection control. I'm scared as well. We all are. No, God isn't doing this on purpose. All those questions. But of course, inside we are. And we knew we weren't immune.
Absolutely. I think the staff in my husband's care home were more worried for the residents who were so very vulnerable. And that's why I think really anyone with any experience on the ground would have thought that was a nonsense to say they will not be infected.
No.
This witness, Hopkins, was also pressed about masks. And she referred, I think, back to module 3, just saying, oh, we're still not sure about the effectiveness of masks. I don't know why she keeps saying this.
Yeah, she said that the advice at the time, which was the same as pre-pandemic advice, which was that people just going about their business don't need to wear masks, and that only the person who is infected and showing symptoms should wear a mask. Well, the fact that it was pre-pandemic guidance means that it wasn't about COVID, it was about other respiratory illnesses. And so, yeah, fine, people can go about their business and work in hospitals, but if this is about guidance that isn't COVID, it's about issues that aren't potentially fatal in the way that COVID was. So how they thought that was appropriate guidance, I don't know. Also, this was a novel virus. So doesn't the precautionary principle kick in where you say, we don't really know enough about it yet, so it could be transmitted in a number of ways. We don't have all the data yet, so everyone wear a face mask. But they weren't going to say that because they didn't have any. And they couldn't say we don't have any because that would show they weren't prepared. And it all comes back to that.
I agree with you 100%. She was also pressed on the guidance from the PHE, as was saying to avoid close contact. But with carers in the social care sphere, how is this possible? You cannot. You have to clean people. Charlotte.
Yeah, absolutely. And yes, in an ideal world, you put a mask on the person who you think is, transmitting. Can you imagine doing that in care and nursing homes of people living with all sorts of, dementia, illness? Yeah, that's just not going to happen. So that's not even a thing. But yes, we had to see the humor in the ridiculousness of the 2-meter rule when you're touching and washing a human being and you're having quite close, intimate, contact with them, with their skin. So again, care homes are geared up to what you wear when you're washing, so aprons on, always bare above the elbow, hair tied back, all that, and with the added, obviously now with masks. Some of the staff are later on, when supply picked up, I remember a couple of women would wear 2, and they're completely and they it looked like a hairnet and the thing that you see in kitchens. It was quite remarkable. That the safety lengths people went, but I got it. They had kids and stuff. But yeah, when it comes to that 2-meter thing, it's like, really? And also, how's that even going to work in a hospital or anywhere else, or in a prison where they share a cell? It's like, what? It's just not gonna. No.
No, I agree.
Just to bring it home how ridiculous this was, Jack Carey said to the witness, why is it that PHE are recommending that we reduce close contact when in reality all the care that they're providing is predominantly close contact? And her answer was, I agree, care that's being provided is close contact. What we were trying to do was provide assurance to the care home staff that if they suspected an infected person, if they removed themselves by 2 meters, that would start to reduce their risk. So that's her answer to why are you telling them to avoid close contact? She's just not engaging with the reality that they were completely unable to do that and do their job. You might as well say don't turn up to work at all, because if you're not doing the close care, you're not doing your job. And she just would not engage with that, and she would not recognize how it's gaslighting to say to someone, we know you're going to have to wash this person and be in close contact, but our advice is to not be in close contact. How does that? It's just ridiculous. And I don't understand how someone is a professor and is leading that organization, but can still come out with something as ridiculous as that.
The chair didn't look impressed. Lady Hallett pressed her for clarification. She, I think she said, you're saying don't use face masks don't have contact, even though it's not possible, and to have good hygiene. And she said this is something people in care homes do as a matter of course. And her response was, I can't remember what she said, but something added on, like, oh, we were just putting it into place. And the chair did not look impressed.
Yeah, so the chair said, you're telling them, don't use face masks. You're telling them, don't have close contact when you know they can't avoid it. You're telling them to have good hygiene, which they would have anyway. And she said, so I'm really not following what this guidance, which was particularly directed at the adult social care sector, added and how it helped them in any way. And her answer was, I think it was just putting it together in one place.
I know, extraordinary.
What guidance that doesn't help anyone in one place is more helpful than guidance that doesn't help in lots of different places. The woman is ridiculous. I'm sorry.
There was in the April guidance, and this is interesting to me because this is right after my husband died in a care home of COVID. And the April guidance apparently said that infected people can be cared for safely in a care home. And there was no advice to isolate non-symptomatic people. And he said this was consensus guidance that would have had a lot of views on it. And this very much reminded me of in previous, well, Module 1 particularly, when we learned a lot about groupthink. That's what, to me, consensus guidance maybe is. And groupthink is specifically in Lady Hallett's recommendations for Module 1. It is specifically cited as a defect. And here we are having her brought up again as a defense in Module 6. Shall we leave her and move on to Jenny Harry's? Again, I don't know, Nicola, I'll open with you and bring Charlotte in.
Jenny Harries, who said in a previous, well, she didn't say it in a previous module, she was asked about a comment that she made, which was that testing is for other countries, not a country as well established as the UK, because we're just so good at everything that we had one of the worst death rates. I mean, yeah, another ridiculous woman, I'm afraid. I'm glad she's retired, but I think it's just you cut the head off one snake and it's replaced by another. She's good in the sense that she recognizes the lack of recognition given to people who work in the care system. So she's good on that in that regard, in that she said, I sensed the officials did not appreciate how care systems worked, and that there was a risk that they weren't engaging with the right people, i.e. people within the care sector who knows how it works when it comes to drafting guidance and things like that. But having said that, she then goes on to say, I recognise this was a novel disease, but basically the asks of isolation and the hierarchies of control around IPC are the same that you would apply to any respiratory infectious disease. Okay. So in that case, how have you recognised that care homes don't have isolation facilities? And that if you are saying that this is a disease that requires isolation, where is your recognition of the difficulties involved in providing care to someone who needs to isolate?
She's actually said isolation in care homes is not unreasonable, without sufficient PPE, without whatever. I mean, can I bring Charlotte in on this?
Yeah, so some care homes do still have double ups, sharing rooms, not just husband and wife. Some of the bigger rooms, even now, they still share. So obviously during the COVID time, room vacancy would usually happen by death. Sometimes it might be a respite, but during COVID that was very rare. But yeah, so if a room came empty, then we'd take one of the double ups into the other room, so that we would try very best that everyone had their own room, so that by virtue of having their own room, they were then isolated, if you like. But that wasn't always possible. So, you know, we have a dignity curtain that goes across the room, and there were times when you follow the measures and you pray that, you know, if the person in bed A does show symptoms, that B doesn't, you know, catch it. So it is really difficult in nursing homes, because also then rooms are allocated by people's mobility and their complex needs, and, you know, and all this sort of thing. So you know, purpose-built isolation facilities, I don't even know what that really means, it isn't really going to happen. It can only happen by people being in their own room on their own. Yeah.
I'm so sorry you didn't have better support. I'm sorry my husband's care home didn't have better support, and for everyone who worked in this industry, many of whom died, that you know, Charlotte. I'm just so sorry they didn't have better support from that government. I think now I come to a moment where I like to ask our guests if they have a standout moment, good or bad, from the week's testimony or the inquiry in general. And I wonder if you had one, Charlotte.
I would say, first, can I say to you, Lorelei, my sincerest condolences to what happened with you, and how raw that pain still is, and how awesome you are that you're doing what you're doing today, you know, and you're giving a voice. So thank you so much for that. I think for me,
Don't make me cry again.
oh, right, okay. I'll get you a cupboard. No, we won't do that again. I think the memorable bit was the bit when I was in the room giving testimony, and it was when I was asked a question about that day when I realised it was just me, and I phoned my husband, and he was actually in the room during that, and I did look over at him, and what was really lovely was that Lady Hallett at the end, in her concluding thing, did acknowledge him being there, and that support. And I just thought, yeah, because I couldn't have done all the things. I could have done anything without him. You know, all these people make us up, don't they? All these people in our lives, they make up who we are. And her acknowledging him, because she'd obviously seen me acknowledge him, that for me was like, yeah, you're switched on, and thanks for noticing the detail. So yeah,
that was a lovely moment, I have to say,
yeah.
and what a beautiful thing to say.
Yeah.
I'll give mine in, then I'll come to Nicola. I think mine was again the TUC, the Trade Union Congress witness. She said something, her reaction, because apparently Matt Hancock talked about banning already low-paid workers from working in other care homes, like restricting them to one. And she said, would you do the same to doctors? I thought that was a good point. And she pointed out that second jobs are very common, not just in a supermarket, and not necessarily in a care home. And it just for me, because he's the one who gets my goat. And I thought this privileged on high person saying it's simple. That's the word he used. He said it would be simple to do this without realizing the reality of people's lives and what they need to do to survive. I think that was my standout moment. Did you have one, Nicola? I'm sure you did.
Yeah. So really interesting, Charlotte, to have heard you say during this conversation about how you are robust and strong-willed enough to have said no to accepting a resident from a hospital. Because Jenny Harries, what she said during week 2 was this: if a care home cannot isolate effectively, there was no requirement to accept. It was a requirement to put your hand up and say, actually, we can't do this. So to all the care homes and all the care workers who felt bullied into accepting someone from hospital, you shouldn't have done, because Jenny Harries said you didn't need to. So the fact that she came out with that just shows how removed people like her were from the reality.
And I mean, in that first time, it was my manager, so she had like the last word. But yeah, it certainly made a difference that her being a registered nurse and us being registered nurses could, yeah, not here, not now. Yeah, it really was. Especially when you get relatives calling saying, "Oh, can we have someone here?"
That must be, I mean, I lived it, so I know how hard that must have
Yeah,
been. And
yeah.
so grateful for everything you did then. So sorry for the price I know you paid for that, Charlotte, but I'm just so grateful that
Well,
you were
and
where you were when you were.
well, you
And I'm
too.
also grateful that you are here with us today. So thank you so much for coming to talk to us.
Thank you for inviting me.
Yeah, thank you so much, Charlotte, for everything you did during the pandemic, for giving evidence, and for joining us today. It really is appreciated. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to this instalment of the COVID Inquiry podcast. We hope you found it insightful and interesting. If you did, please rate us on the podcast platform you use and share the pod with friends and family who may value this type of commentary. We're looking forward to you joining us next week for more expert commentary, opinion, and insight into the COVID Inquiry evidential hearings.